Hey everyone, let's go ahead and make a start. I hope you can hear me in the back. It is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you to this special kind of joyous occasion, which we're celebrating the publication of Timothy Garton Ash's new book, Homelands, A Personal History of Europe. Now, Tim, as most of you know, hardly needs an introduction. He's obviously a very well-known figure at this center, his college, his university, across the country, across Europe, and beyond. He's a very accomplished, high-profile journalist and historian who writes often for The Guardian, New York Review of Books, and a range of other news outlets across Britain and Europe. He's author of 10 previous books, many of which deal with European affairs in various forms, especially in light of the revolutions of 1989 and their aftermath. Since the 1980s, he's been one of the key figures who has given us a front row seat on the political drama of Central Europe. Now, having read his book, it seems like he's been absolutely everywhere. He seems like he's spoken to absolutely everyone, the great, the good, as well as the not so great and not so good at times. He's certainly been at or has covered all the hotspots since the 1980s, from Central Europe to wartime Yugoslavia, from Brexit Britain, and most recently to Ukraine. In the book, he provides dispatches from places of political transformation and always brings with it kind of clear-eyed vision and measured judgment. The book has received a great deal of media attention already. Some of you probably noted the FT review a few days ago and the very positive review there in the Sunday Times on Sunday. So congratulations to him for those. The book itself is a kind of unique blend of personal history and reportage about his life covering Europe, and what he calls history illustrated by memoir. And that way, it's a kind of genre-bending account of Europe. The subject matter of the book covers the fate of communism in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, and you can argue the fate of liberalism in the first 2 decades of the 21st. Underscores the point that Central Europe has been a laboratory and experimental field of political ideologies since over the course of the 20th century, and Tim's dispatches in many ways have been important installments in that broader story of the region. In all his work, he's combining the role of historian and eyewitness, and much of the book is a kind of reflection on how Europe has changed, but also on how he has changed. So it's a range of meditations on earlier views and journal entries of the political shifts in and around Europe. And that way, you're treating both the history of the continent and the history of his earlier assessments of the continent. And as always, it's engagingly, beautifully written. He brings with it a kind of characteristic verve and clarity. Now, with that, we have, I think, 3 ideal commentators who are going to offer a set of reflections for us. So, in the agreed format is that we would have the commentators, and then Tim will respond to them, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. Our first speaker then is Lenka Bustikova, who is Associate Professor at Eastern European Comparative Politics here at Oxford, who joined the DPIR and OSCA last October. She's the author of a prize-winning book on extreme reactions, radical right mobilization in Eastern Europe. She's also published widely on patronage and clientelism, and has a forthcoming co-authored book on defection denied, a study of civilian support for insurgency in irregular war. And now she's working on a new book project about the social origins of illiberalism, exploring the relationship between uncivil society and political radicalization in Eastern Europe. Our second speaker is Sonia Cuesta, who was an advanced DPhil student in history, whose research focuses on the relationship between Francoist repression and political change in the 1960s and 70s Spain, using special prisons for social and sexual dissidents in the regime as her case study. In it, she uses a mix of documents and from the penitentiary archives and interviews with inmates and prison directors, and her work offers a unique and new window into the political practices of Franco Spain. Our last speaker will be David Priestland, very well known to people around the university, professor of modern history here at Oxford, a specialist on the Soviet Union, having published a number of very important books on the Soviet Union, including his magisterial history of global communism called The Red Flag, Communism and the Making of the Modern World, published in 2009. In the last 10 years or so, he's shifted emphasis toward history of market liberalism since the 1970s, and has published a book called Merchant Soldier Sage, A New History of Power, published by Penguin in 2012. And he's now working on history of market liberalism with special reference to the former communist world. So each one of our speakers has kind of 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll allow Tim to respond to the 3 of them, and then we'll just open up to questions for people in the audience here and those joining us online. And welcome, of course, to those people as well. So please.
Yeah, thank you all for very kind introduction. This is a wonderful book. Congratulations. It was, great pleasure reading it. One way to think about it, this is a book, one might think of it as personal confessions of a liberal. And it's a tour de force of contemporary European history. And I think one day someone is going to steal your phone logs and write a dissertation about all the various conversations and contacts. So, if someone is looking up a dissertation out there, I think this might be a good way to start. It's a wonderful blend. It's a very unusual book. It's a wonderful blend of personal memories intertwined with major historical events. And the way the book is written, the format of it, I think, is quite important and noteworthy. And in some way, a bit disturbing, because it's a series of episodes that mirror sort of the erratic nature of the contemporary world. So in a way, you can open the book and you can read it anywhere, because you will be introduced, you'll get an insight into this episode, and then you go next to another episode. So in a way, you can read it from the beginning to the end, but you can just read it the other way around in some way. But you can, in a way, go in and out of the book, and that's I will come back sort of the nature and the way the book is structured. So, I'm dealing with my daughter's obsession with TikTok, but in some way your book reminds me of TikTok. It's really, these are sort of short episodes, then you go to the next episode, and it's this, assemblage of things. And so, but I think what it tells us also is that because the way you think, it's actually quite remarkable that the way you think about history is in these short segments of personal episodes intertwined with historical events, is that maybe this is how we live and now how we perceive history today. And, there's, again, at the same time, there's something disturbing and something profound about it. So let me just read a brief sort of statement about a self-professed champion of liberal internationalism. After sort of reading this brief segment, which is on page 249, I want to tell you what went wrong and why is it that nobody anticipated it, and what could have been. And maybe if you can walk us back through some of these episodes, if you were to highlight, the origins of demolition. So one of the episodes in the book is called The Demolition, which is, about sort of reversal of liberal democracy in Eastern Europe. So what were the warning signs? Because the warning signs are all over the book, but because it's presented in these episodic events, it's not possible to find the critical juncture, or maybe a series of critical junctures where things were wrong, nobody noticed it, nobody paid attention. So I sort of want to, my question to you would be, can you walk us back to maybe what you would consider to be critical junctures and sort of things that could have been done differently? But so, sort of the quote from 241 from the book. It's not that we liberal internationalists were blind. We saw many of the gathering problems and discontents, from Islamic terrorism to the disaster of Iraq, the overheating of financial capitalism, and citizens' revolt against the proposed European Constitution. But after a quarter century in which history had so unexpectedly gloriously gone our way, we did tend to assume that these would be temporary setbacks, obstacles on an upward path, delaying but not reversing the larger course of historical developments. And, and quote, that is always a mistake, and one that historians should be the last people to make. So then my question to you would be, if you were to go through these episodes, and again, the origins of the demolition are scattered through the episodes, what were the critical junctions? And maybe, as you whispered to the work readers throughout your life, would you have whispered something differently? One, a tough question, but I think that's on everybody's mind as they, read through the book and see the warning signs scattered. So maybe there is nothing that could have been done because this is at the 5,000 cuts. But I again, I want to push back on the origins of that.
All right, for me, just to hark back on some of those points, that was really fascinating. Something that struck me more about the book was the content itself. As a historian, these themes of memory and personal involvement are incredibly important. And well, Timothy in the book reflects early in the prologue and on Homelands, but this book is not aimed as a personal history, meaning his own history, but rather conversation between himself and other Europeans in the complex stage of the continent during the 20th century. Because this is indeed a personal history, but it's also a history of people, as well as a very compelling review of Europe since 1945. 20th century European history has indeed been scarred by the experience of violence, silences, and obliterations. Every nation, every town, every family, and every person retains their own memory of this European division, be it internal or international. Some of these have been trickled down throughout multiple generations. Marian Hirsch labeled this post-trauma, transgenerational trauma. That is the fact that memories of traumatic events live on to mark the lives of those who are not there to experience them. Something that Timothy was labels the memory engine. Homelands vividly paints a picture of some of these stories. Some from leading figures in European politics, others from so-called ordinary people who experience the reality of this time in their own flesh. I myself has devoted the last many years to studying the victims of Francoism and Francoist repression as a duty to those who are no longer present. Because since 1968, and since 1945, since 1914, we know that forgetting is not an option. We should no longer allow ourselves to be blessed by oblivion. And in Homelands, I think Timothy makes a great deal of effort in making us remember. The question that came to mind as I was reading was, what really makes Europe? Europe is an idea more than a geographical understanding. This idea has been constantly constructed individually. One of the greatest achievements of the book is that we're brought into this conversation about history and how it shaped Timothy and other Europeans around him. He says in his book, there are as many understandings of Europe as there are Europeans. In a very broad sense of the term, expect around 850 million potential understandings of Europe, each derived from their own experience. But yet this history is, as a result of this, potentially filled with ambiguity and contradictions. Throughout the 20th century, we're trying to rebuild. Sadly, or maybe luckily, there's no such thing as a black and white. And Timothy reminds us of this, or correct ethical procedure by which we can all adopt to go forward. The European project was created from the desire to rebuild our society from the ashes of the early to mid 20th century. We cannot forget how diverse our experiences of Europe are. We speak about a north-south divide or an east-west divide in Europe, but we equally remain divided within our individual countries. Not just that, but something that Timothy goes back in and out every now and then in the book is that he finds himself in his present moment, and yet when he's having a certain conversation or he's traveling to a specific place, he finds himself being back in time in a different time period. And this is something that I found myself very much in my interviews with victims of Francoism. I found myself traveling back to the 1930s in the way that my grandfather still wraps his books, certain books in his bookshelf that are too liberal or too left-wing. And he's afraid that someone that might come to his house might see them as potentially risky and someone might denounce him as something that they'd seen when he was younger. Or other interviewees, the children of those who were killed during the Civil War, lowering the voices in the streets when they're telling their stories because they didn't want anyone else to hear what they were talking about. European identity remains profoundly individual and polarized. Indeed, there is a single understanding of Europe. Spain alone, as in what is the same as Portugal and Italy and Greece, differ from their other European counterparts in their experience. From a divided memory of war and dictatorship to corruption and continued silences, Spain may sometimes feel only Spanish and not European, but this is arguably true. And this is something that, again, echoes very, very strongly within the book. Homelands sets to uncover these ambiguities in the search of a whole by retelling the stories of many to offer a nuanced understanding of what divides us and brings us together. And reminds us that maybe there is a kaleido tapestry, a term that Timothy takes on in this book, or a commonality that we see between each of them. In a way, Tim, as well as other historians and journalists, are the ones who have created a modern Europe by working across cultures. Because Europe is a continent really shaped by an idea. Not just that, but as a community, we are affected by each other's stories. Not only understanding the past, but also the present. And maybe these stories can also offer us a glimpse into the future. On a personal level, as a social historian and Southern European with a very complex family history, Timothy's book has reminded me of how our own personal identity is intrinsically shaped by those around us. Not only family stories of background, but those stories of people that we meet. Our identities are given, but also made. Through these experiences of Europe, we may vastly differ from historical periods, geographical locations, and our relation to our kinship networks. But it's in our hands to keep the past alive and uphold unity and mutual respect in the space of vastly changing and yet so real current histories. In the wake of a time of increasing difficulty, this collage of stories, once again, this collage of tapestry, teaches us that after a time of revolution or war, we're now experiencing a revolution of time. That maybe by only listening to the echoes of the past, we may begin to untangle some of the knots in this tapestry and begin to rebuild once more as a community. As well as remember, in the wake of the complete devastation following 1945, it is our duty to strive as much as we can for unity, be it through the European project or be it just through the preservation of human rights and peace. My question on all of this, as a social historian again, was very much focused on how intrinsically the stories affect us as researchers. There's something really fascinating in your retelling of being in Oxford in July of 1995, and potentially concurrently at the same time, you experiencing the story of that boy who cried mother, the Bosnian boy cried mother. To what extent, I guess, can we separate from this, but yet and see the bigger picture and understand that this may not take these stories as a means to an end, but rather take them all together and create a more nuanced understanding going forward.
Well, I'd like to echo what has already been said about this book. I very much enjoyed it. Elegant and very highly readable combination of analytical reportage, history and memoir. And Tim covers an enormous number of themes, which I could pick up on, but we don't have much time. So I think I'll just talk about a couple. I think the first concerns the genre of before. And in a way, this is a historian's memoir. And I think the historian's memoir is a genre I've always found delightful and is surprisingly rare. I'm thinking about Eric Hobsbawm's Interesting Times, or the American French historian William Sewell's Logics of History. And this is a particularly valuable genre, I think, because historians can use the analytical tools they've developed as historians when looking at the past, and also investigate the more sort of affective, emotional issues. That is, what's it like to be living in an era, in a past era? And Tim's book certainly offers this, but I think it offers more because he is like the other historians, memoirists I mentioned. He's remembering how he thought and placing that in a historical context. But as a writer of long-form reportage, he's also writing about encounters with a range of other figures, both elite and non-elite. And as an influential commentator, he's both participant in and critic of the major debates in Europe over the past 30 years or so. So I'm sure this is a book that, as others have said, will be regularly referred to by future historians. I'm sure it'll be an extremely useful source in itself. My next point is also related to the book as a work of history, and in particular, the explanatory framework, if you like, of the book. Now, of course, this isn't an academic monograph in which, with a rather heavy, dull methodological introduction justifying its approach, but I think I could at least identify two major approaches, one of which sees the people that are being looked at in the context of their national histories, and the other which places them in the context of their generations. And that has a major role in the book, I think, and in the Mannheimian vein, in the context of the major political experiences that have shaped them in their youth. So he tells the story of the 1914ers, who built Europe in the first place, the 1939ers, of whom his father was one, who had rather varied experiences of the war, depending on their nationality, the 68ers, famous 68ers, of course, and the 89ers. And Tim places himself, in part, in this generational context. He tells of how he came of age, and his political age, in the years immediately after the global shocks of 1973. And one of his first political memories was being in Crete in that year during protests against the Kurds. And Tim defines this generation in Western Europe, at least in a rather sort of self-deprecating way, as the spliff end of the 1960s. But I think it's a more important and influential generation than that. I see it as a generation, and I'd be interested in what Tim thinks of this actually, because I see it as a generation disillusioned with the radical left politics of the 68ers, but still idealistic. And in a way, that idealism was transferred to the struggle against state authoritarianism of both left and right. So whether the Greek colonels and Pinochet or the Soviets and Maoists. And in a way, this is the generation in the West marked by the rise of Amnesty International, and of course, human rights and dissent, and dissent in Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe. This, of course, is the generation of Tony Blair and also of European leaders like Barroso, who's, as Tim tells us in Homelands, tells us that his first political memory was of this sort of looking at a photograph and noticing the absurdity of the Salazar regime. And reading this got me thinking really about the contrast with my own generation. I was actually brought up, as I discovered, in a very similar part of London to Tim, but I'm of a sort of half generation younger, coming to political awareness in the early 1980s from the early 1970s. And I think the generational difference is huge, even though that's only 10 years. My generation was one of much greater polarization of economic issues and and also, I think, much less idealistic, at least if we're talking about the centre and the left. So I'd be interested in Tim's comments on that. And this brings me to my next point on Tim's account of the history of his generation, and the broad arc of the book, which has been referred to by others, which is in a way that of a Greek tragedy. It is one of idealism, hubris, and then nemesis. Although I don't think the word nemesis is mentioned, that's a bit negative. But I've always thought, of Tim as a sort of Isaiah Berlin style skeptic about grand systems, whether left or right, communist or neoliberal. And in the past, he's criticised the more utopian evangelists of Friedman and Hayek in Central Eastern Europe. But in Homelands, in this book, he performs a sort of mea culpa, associating himself with a liberal hubris, not only on questions of liberal democracy, but also on neoliberal economics. I know he doesn't like the term neoliberalism. As he says, quote, "We linked our dream of spreading individual liberty much too closely to one particular model of globalized, financialized capitalism." And I'd be interested in him expanding on that. I mean, was this actually a positive belief in neoliberal economics? Was it just a sense that many had in many parts of the political spectrum that this economic system was sort of just inevitable and not worth challenging? Or did neoliberalism, if you like, smuggle itself surreptitiously and unnoticed into a broader liberal worldview in a way that it didn't in the 70s, perhaps even in the 80s? And finally, I'm running out of time, I know. But it's not just generation that structures this account, but I think also nation, and in particular, the trajectory of Britain itself. And I suppose another narrative arc in the book is about Britain, and in particular, a particular British person who, as he says, was not born a European, but became a European through conscious desire to absorb European culture. It's a sort of echo of de Beauvoir in that. As he says, he was brought up in a conservative background, but actually became a European. And in a way was part of a generation which was able then to join Europe, but has now been isolated again by his fellow country people. And in a way, I recognize this myself. You know, I, like Tim, avidly read Thomas Mann and Goethe as a student, much more so than Dickens and Shakespeare. And in a way, this follows the trajectory of many Europhile British intellectuals, academics. And At the end of the book, Tim strikes an optimistic note. He says we shouldn't fall into some Stefan Zweig style nostalgic pessimism. Stefan Zweig did about the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But I suppose I finished this book, if not pessimistic, at least thoughtful about the future of, in a way, this culture that both of us were rather entranced by as students. That is, you know, we may go back into Europe, the younger generation is rather Europhile at the moment, it seems, but will that culture come back with it? You know, will they be reading Thomas Mann? Should they be reading Thomas Mann? How will that be integrated with a much more global type of cultural education that this new generation will be? Thank you.
Thank you, all three of you. Tim?
Thank you very much. That was three fantastic sets of comments. Lenka reminds me of TikTok. I'm not absolutely sure I want probably to put that on the cover. Let me say a few words myself about the book and then come to responding. This book took me just 50 years to write. It's 50 years of traveling around Europe, writing things down in notebooks like that, studying Europe, living, breathing, writing about, worrying about Europe. But even when I went to the furthest flying corner of Europe, I generally came back to one place, which was this place. I mean, quite specifically, the European Studies Centre, which I first came to when I was an undergraduate in 1976. Our home is just up the road, this college, this university. So the first thing I want to say is a huge thank you to all the wonderful colleagues in this centre, in this college, in this university, because I've learned so much from you all and from the conversation with you. This book would have been impossible without you. The second thing I want to say is a huge thank you to all the students who worked with me on this book. Particularly those who worked as research assistants. Sonia was too modest to say. She does some fantastic work in this book on Spain and actually appears in the book herself, along with her grandparents who were Gastarbeiter in Germany. She tells some fascinating oral history about their return. Joseph, Freya, Olivier, Alex, Marilena, where are you all? I can't see you all, but thank you so much. You did a fantastic job. And any academic worth their salt learns from their students, and I've learned a lot from you. I also want, if I may, to say one other thank you. There's one person who has put up with and supported my sometimes hectic traveling around Europe for more than 40 years and given me a second homeland, which is Poland. And that's my wife, Danuta. Thank you very much. Please, a round of applause. Now, this book, people have been trying to define the genre. The way I would define it is history illustrated by memoir and reportage, but with the emphasis on history. So what it isn't is just a series of anecdotes and vignettes strung together like washing on a clothesline, right? So every anecdote and vignette has a particular historical point. So for example, when I describe someone I knew only as Yiji, who I met in Prague in 1979, who was saving up, he'd been saving up for 7 years to afford 1 week in Paris. Because in Czechoslovakia in 1979, you only got $12 a day allowance. So he was going to sleep in the car and eat canned food. But he was so much looking forward to it. My 10th wedding anniversary. And that's not just an anecdote, it's telling you why people behind the Iron Curtain were getting so unhappy already at that time. When I tell the story of having a Polish dinner with the Polish Pope John Paul II, and him saying at some point, the trouble with capitalism and communism is that I dislike the one almost as much as the other. That's not just an amazing story. It also tells you something about the attitude of the Roman Catholic Church, particularly in post-communist Europe. When I tell the story of Helmut Kohl, who those of you who saw him when he came to this college will recall, was an enormous man. And not just in height, but in girth, what Dr. Johnson calls a mountainous man. He was enormous, and he was towering over me in his office in Bonn. We were talking in 1991 after German unification. And he suddenly said, by the way, you realize you're sitting opposite the direct successor to Adolf Hitler. What does one say? My dear fellow, don't take it so hard. What I should have said is actually there was Grand Admiral Dönitz after Hitler being Hitler, and you, so you're not. But I was so completely gobsmacked by this remark. I think the biggest conversation stopper I've ever heard. That I didn't think of it, but of course, he was saying it for a reason. This is the Chancellor of Germany, unlike some of his successors, who had a real sense of history. And he was conscious of his historical position. I'm going to do everything differently. I'm going to, instead of putting a German roof over Europe, I'm going to put a European roof over Germany. When I tell the story of meeting Vladimir Putin as Deputy Mayor of St. Petersburg in 1994, totally unknown. No one had heard of the guy. Some of you have heard the story before. I'm sorry about that, but totally unknown. Rather unpleasant looking man, slightly rat-like face, sitting in a corner at this conference. And at the end of 2 days, he pipes up and says, we have to remember that there are territories that were always Russian, always Russian, that are now outside the frontier of the Russian Federation, and we have a duty towards them. And he specifically mentions Crimea, 1994. And he says there are 25 million Russians outside the Russian Federation, and we have a duty to protect. It's not just an anecdote. It tells you that the imperialist revanchist impulse was there way back in 1994, 5 years before the first NATO enlargement. Don't tell me NATO enlargement is the cause of what's happening in Ukraine. Of course, you can't draw a straight line from that to 2014, his seizure of Crimea, but nonetheless, it's significant. And finally, right at the end of the book, chronologically, right at the very end of the book, chronologically, I managed to get in an account of the trip I made to Ukraine in December last year. And one of the stories I tell in that section of the book is about a man who I describe only as Yevgen, who was an editor, translator, a cultural critic, one of us. After the full-scale invasion last year, he decided he had to sign up to fight for his country. Fought for months. He'd been wounded, invalided out, didn't need to go back, but he'd gone back and fought for more months in the campaign for Kherson, through muddy fields, living in dugouts that he himself dug out, seeing friends killed around him. Been badly wounded, come out to Lviv, and he told me, I want to go back. He was killed on the last day of last week, December 31st. I only found out about this a few weeks ago. Yevgen Kulevich was his name. And I don't just tell that as an anecdote, but just to remind us all that we now have the largest war in Europe since 1945 going on as we speak here. And there are some very, very brave people paying a very high price. So that's about the character of the book. In my own mind, I don't want to go on about this too long, but I will come to your questions. The central thread running through the book is the story of Europe and freedom. Or to put it more accurately, of Europe and the question of freedom. It's the question for an Isaiah Berlin, the question for an I mean, obviously there are other themes. There's immigration and the way it's changed Europe. There's the way our freedom movement internally is leading us to build new Berlin walls around the edge of Europe. There's the Eurozone, there's Britain and the tragedy of Brexit, there's the impact of the 68s. But for me, that's the central story. And essentially put it in absolutely through this summary, it's a line, and this goes to one of your questions, it's a line that gradually ascends up to a certain point and then turns and starts to descend. In 1943, there were only 4 free countries in Europe, perilously: Britain, Ireland, Sweden, and Switzerland. By 1973, when I started traveling on the continent, Freedom House reckons there were 17, but most Europeans still lived under dictatorships. We actually did the numbers. You count the European republics of the Soviet Union, 389 million Europeans living under dictatorships, including obviously Southern Europe. Only 289 million living in relatively free countries. Turkey somewhere in it. And then what you see for the next 35 years is this ascending curve in which freedom spreads, and with it you get what I call the enlargement of the West. So the enlargement of the 2 key institutions of the West, what we now call the EU and NATO. Starting with Southern Europe, your side, with Spain, Portugal, and Greece, which in 1973 were still all under dictatorships. Othon knows this very well. He did a book about the Greek military dictatorship. Formative experience for Javier Solana, for Jose Maria Barroso, for Maria Damanakis, who went on to be a European Commission. So many of the leading figures in the European Union had these formative experiences under dictatorship. Then, of course, it spreads to East Central Europe, to your part of the world, Lenka. Lenka's life would have been very different if we hadn't had 1989 and that story of liberation of East Central Europe. And then onwards to the Baltic States, 1990-91. Parts of the former Soviet Union in a slightly more ambiguous and complex way. And of course, to Southeastern Europe. So that by the time you get to 2004, Freedom House is counting 35 free countries, nearly half the free countries in the world. Of course, many of them new countries. And by the time we get to 2007, the EU, which is the European Economic Community, it had just 6 members in 1972, has 27 going on 28 with Croatia, and NATO has about 27. So this huge story, for me, utterly inspiring, about the forward march of freedom and the enlargement of the West. Of course, it has to be qualified. What do you mean by freedom in this context? What kind of freedom? I have a whole chapter on East Central Europe, to your point, called Freedom and its Discontents, all the ways in which freedom was disappointing and inadequate, but nonetheless. And then, 2008, the turning point, the big turning point. And the combination of the global financial crisis and Putin's annexation of 2 great chunks of Georgia is what I call the start of the downward track. Interestingly, it's not 9/11, right? Do you remember how after 9/11, we all said, this is a great turning point. That's the end of the post-1989 period. It changed the Middle East. Worse. It changed the United States very significantly, and to that extent impacted ours. But I would argue that it was not the great turning point looking back in European history. 2008 is a much bigger turning point. From that time on, it's one bloody crisis after another. Europe is like a boxer on the ropes, getting hit after hit after hit on the face. Global financial crisis segues into the Great Recession, then the Eurozone crisis, which of course had a huge human cost in countries like Greece, which I write about. 2010, Viktor Orban starts demolishing democracy inside Hungary, already a full member state of the EU. That wasn't meant to be possible. 2014, seizure of Crimea, the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian war. 2015-16 refugee crisis, Brexit, Trump, COVID, anti-liberal populisms in countries like France and Germany and Italy, and then down all the way to the 24th of February 2022. And the full-scale war in Ukraine, which I argue is the end of what I call the post-wall period, the period since 1989. And the book takes this shape, which I had not at all expected when I started out, because it starts in 1945 with the end of a major land war in Europe, and ends in 2022 with the beginning of a major land war in Europe. That's not a shape I'd anticipated. Now, to your questions, page 249. 271. 271. Yeah, better be.
No, 2-4.
So, why the downward turn? My answer to that question can be given in one word: hubris. Our old Greek friend hubris, but hubris that comes in multiple variants. The hubris of the United States, which thinks it's a new Rome in a unipolar world, a hyperpower, and therefore it can transform the Middle East by invading Iraq. The hubris of Tony Blair's Cool Britannia, which thinks you can just go on opening, and there won't be a backlash. The hubris of myself and my friends in East Central Europe, who thought in 2008-9, mission accomplished, democracy consolidated in Hungary and Poland, that is secured by the EU, and they could nothing of the kind. The hubris of the Eurozone, very clearly visible around that time. 2006, 7, 8, I quote a speech by Jean-Paul Trichet, the governor of the ECB, who says, everything's going swimming, two little problems below us. The hubris of the entire EU, which believed that all the rest of the world had to do was to graciously follow our example. Mark Leonard's book, Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century. The hubris, and I pick up your point, of globalized, financialized capitalism. Both words are crucial, globalized and financial, a combination of the two, which sees free markets as a solution to almost everything, which believes that global aggregate gains will compensate for specific local losses, right? An economist's view, but populism taught us something different. And the hubris of a liberalism, which had become essentially one-dimensional, essentially reduced liberalism to economic liberalism, ignoring its political and social and cultural dimension, and believed if you got it's the economist view, right? If you get the economics right, everything else will follow. Well, again, populism, particularly in Central Europe, but also elsewhere, taught us something different. Number one, if half your society hasn't benefited from the aggregate gains. Number two, there's not just the inequality of income or property, there's also what I call the inequality of respect and attention. The Polish populists talked about the redistribution of respect. And it's a really important point because these populisms are always a mix of the economic and the culture. So that's my answer to you. And underlying this hubris was what I call a historiosophical mistake. And that mistake was to take the way history had been going for the last 30, 35 years and assume that history was going to go on that way. So we took history with a small h, always a product of conjuncture, chance, choice, individual leadership, and turned it into history with a big H, Hegelian inevitable process of the progress of freedom. And that, I think, was one of the big mistakes David. And if I was going to whisper something to world leaders, I don't need any world leaders anymore, but if I was going to whisper in their ears, it'd be rather like the person who whispered into Caesar's, remember that Caesar is mortal. I would, remember that the way things have been is not necessarily the way things are going to be, that we don't know the way history is going to go, and that it's going to be up to us. And with that, two quick last responses. First, both David and Sonia. I hate doing this, but I'm looking at myself and how it influences us as a historian. Many historians like to take a sort of Olympian stack and assume or want you to assume that they have Olympian detachment. Nobody has Olympian detachment, even if they're writing about the 9th century, right? So one of the first people I studied, one of the things I studied when I came to do history at Oxford, was the controversy about Anglo-Saxon England. Any of you remember that? Anyone old enough to remember? David, I can see. Been round and freed about the meaning of Anglo-Saxon England. Actually, they were playing out an argument of their own times, as historians always do. So in my view, historians like journalists need to be honest. It's much better just to be upfront and say, this is the position from which I'm writing. I'm a socialist, or I'm a liberal, or I'm a conservative. These were my formative experiences. And then write from that position of explicit honesty. And so it is a book of self-reflection and self-criticism. Liberals. But to the mea culpa, David, can I just say a word about neoliberalism? David is writing the book about neoliberalism. That's why we're talking about neoliberalism. I think there's a misunderstanding that sometimes comes in when people talk about neoliberalism as the key to understanding this country. They talk about it almost as if it was something like fascism or communism, a great ideology which people studied and debated. My experience in this period was it wasn't like that at all. There was actually only a minority of whom in East Central Europe, Václav Klaus, where we were. Václav Klaus, who was lecturing me about free market economics, even during the Velvet Revolution in South Africa. But bronię sobie Tadeusz Mazowiecki, Paweł, Janusz Kisz, all the people who were leading the transition to East Central Europe, our friends in East Germany, they probably never read one for free. They didn't give a damn. It wasn't like people who were communists in the 1940s who were having theoretical debates. They just thought, I have no idea how to build a capitalist economy. This is the way capitalist economies seem to be working at the moment. And what is more, the West, with the so-called Washington Consensus, is telling us this is what we have to do if you're going to get loans, if you're going to get Western capital. So I think, yes, it was a big mistake to hitch our political liberalism to globalized, financialized capitalism. But I don't think it was falling as a prey to the ideology of neoliberalism. It was the practice of capitalism as it had emerged. And by the way, I think the guys who were the traders who were driving up from Essex at 4 o'clock in the morning to make gazillions of money on the markets in London probably weren't reading Friedrich von Hayek either. Last question, and with this I look forward to the discussion. So Sonia did some wonderful work, as I said, on this question of generations in Europe, which you also picked on, the 14ers, the 39ers, the 68ers, the 89ers, who were those, Karl Mannheim says your formative political experience is roughly between the age of 17 and 25. Pretty good fun. So the 89ers, those who were Milad, Rahulova, Tim Snyder, Anne Applebaum, Ivan Krasnik, they're the 89ers. There are quite a few in this book, right? And then I did this exercise with our students here, many of you in this room. The post-89ers, what was their formative experience? And we couldn't find it. There wasn't a formative moment. The formative experience was freedom of movement, right? But there wasn't a particular moment. And then somebody said to me when I was giving a lecture in Garton the other day, looking at what we're going through now, the largest war in Europe since 1945, this war in Ukraine, is the opposite of everything Europe stood for, the never again. Don't you think that might create a new generation, the 22ers. And I think that's a really interesting question on which to throw this open. If there might be actually a new generation of the 22ers who would pick Europe up out of the doldrums and maybe turn the line round so it starts ascending again. And on that, I look forward very much to discussion.